That means that if the Ikvis the Mashiach, which is the period, the generation before the Mashiach appears, is close to the Kates, you see, that means that it's a Hanukah say Yichud which will be doing the main job through Yesud and through Tzoros and through very little Bechira. So the Jews who live at that time will go through what's called the Chevre Mashiach. There will be great suffering and very little Bechira. Therefore, there will be very frum Jews at that time. And even the Jews who are not frum, their involvement with Bechira will be very small. That's why most of the Jews today who are not frum, what is their Bechira? Well, most of them are Tinik Shenishba. Most of them are born on circumstances, but they don't know much about Yiddishkeit and so on. So then what is their tachlis? Their tachlis many times revolves around one mitzvah or two mitzvahs their entire life. In other words, as you get to the end, the Banishim is not concerned with whether or not this person is going to keep all Tayag mitzvahs and be a tzaddik gamma. What he's really concerned with now is whether this person will keep one mitzvah, the main mitzvah, which is, let's say, whether or not he'll marry a shiksa, or marry a woman who is not from, or he'll maintain his Jewish identity, or become an anti-Semite, you see. The Banishim is now testing out these Jews, you see, in very few mitzvahs, and on the mitzvahs which have to do with the fundamental ik of the Emunah, in that sense. Because these Jews are already at the end. They're at the end of the period already. And the way that they're bringing the tikkun is through the Hanukah Yichud, which is not concerned with large amounts of Bechira. So these people who are not from, fundamentally, where are they coming from? Many of these people were obviously neshamas that once lived before, but failed in their tachlis in some way or another. And because they failed in their tachlis, they had to be reborn in a period where they would have much smaller bechira than they would have had before. So whereas at the outset, they would have been tested on Tayag mitzvahs, you see, in the final outcome, they're not tested on all 650 mitzvahs, because they failed before. So therefore the punishment was only testing on a couple of mitzvahs. So therefore he's going to put them in a time, you see, he's going to put them in a time in the matzav where a great deal of the generation of Jews, Bechlal in general, are not involved in mitzvahs, in that sense. And that's more or less what we see today. We see this today because basically the Mashiach has not arrived, even though we are still in the period of Adam Mishanach Achet. The Mashiach has not arrived and we're very close to the gates. That means that the major thing now which is working is the Hanukah Yichud, not the Hanukah Mishpat. That's why you see tremendous tzoros. That's why you see it's very hard to find really good Frum Yidden today, and why so many Jews are no more Frum. You see, because the midah which is bringing about the Geula is different than the midah that would have brought the Geula had the Geula happened a long time ago. So fundamentally, we see there are two modes or two ways that the Yemos Mashiach can be brought about. Either through Be'achishena, which means that it's brought about to the Hanukah Mishpat, to Bechira, or Be'ita, where it's brought about involuntarily to the Hanukah Yichud, to Yesun and to Tzoros. Basically, this is the thing. Now, one thing is important to realize, that even in the Achishena, there are two different types of Achishenas. There's what's called a standard Achishena, and there's what's called a special Achishena. What do I mean? Even though we say that the Mashiach can come at any time, right? If Christ told the Tshuva and does all the mitzvahs, right? Right? But nevertheless, there are certain times which are more masugal than other times. In other words, there are certain times in the history of the world where suddenly the Banishim gives a certain yecholis to the entire Bria that it becomes easier to bring the Mashiach than at other times. And other times it's more difficult. In other words, to Achishena or to Maisim, we can always bring the Mashiach. However, there are certain special times which are critical periods and are like Matsugo, to bring the Mashiach much easier and much faster than other times themselves. And that's what we find throughout history. Throughout history, there are certain critical Achishena periods that the world had a much better opportunity, an Eitz Rotzen, to bring it, but obviously they failed. So that's another important concept between the usual Achishena periods and the special Achishena periods. Now, there's another concept also, that as long as the world can bring the Mashiach to Achishena, it means that it can fail as well. Achishena means that what? Achishena means that the Jews can bring the Mashiach by their deeds. That's what Achishena means. However, since it's not the end, it's not the case, and it has to do with deeds, the Satan is always given the ability to try and trip them up. Whenever the Sultan gets wind that there's a special Achishena around, he instantly musters all his forces to try and makakel it. And because it's only an Achishena, he always has reshus. He always has permission. You see, when he found out and he got wind that the Jews were about to get the Yemais Mashiach in the time of Yetzias Mitzrayim, he mustered up all his forces and he said to Banisham, I ask you, since this is an Achishena, give me one possibility of destroying this. I want to test them through the union of the Chet of the Egel. That's what I want to do. You see, the Banisham in effect had to allow that. Why? Because it's an Achishena. You see, because fundamentally the Banisham is saying that you will bring the Mashiach through your deeds. Well, if it's through your deeds, there's Bechira. If there's Bechira, the Sultan must have a chance to try and makakel the thing. You see? So that's the whole thing. The Sultan is constantly attempting to destroy the possibility of Achishena, which is right. Because that's the nature of Achishena, to bring it by deeds. However, in the special times, or in the critical periods, when the world is more masugel to bring Mashiach, the Yetzer Hara suddenly becomes more sensitized to that possibility, and his kitzur becomes much bigger, and he's allowed to do a much bigger Nisayon than usual. Now, if Klal Yisrael fails in that Nisayon, doing those special Achishenas, what happens? If Klal Yisrael fails to bring the Mashiach in each Achishena, every day, because of the lack of doing tshuva and so on and so forth, then they have to do it constantly by more Hanogas HaYichud. However, if a critical Achishena happens, which is more sensitive to the possibility of bringing the Mashiach, then the Sultan is able to try and counteract it even more. If they fail, what happens is the following. A bigger tzorah comes on Klal Yisrael than usual. Many times the biggest tzorahs that came on the world and on Klal Yisrael were really tzorahs that came in as an alternative to the Masugaldika period of bringing the Mashiach at that point in time. Many times, because Klal Yisrael fails to be Omer ben Nisayon, what originally was an Eis Rotzen, now becomes an Eis Choiv. So the tzorah becomes much worse. I heard said that once that one of these periods was right before, in about 1910, there was a feeling, a very strong feeling, that at that point in time, there was a very critical period to bring the Mashiach. And I don't know clearly what the Nisayon was then or what have you, but since Klal Yisrael failed in some way to bring it, World War I broke out. You see, so this is the thing. You will find many times when the Chazal, when the Rishonim and Achronim predicted Yemais Mashiach at a certain time, when the Mashiach did not appear, it wasn't the fact that they were wrong, it was the fact that they were pointing to a certain critical period. And if that critical period didn't happen, usually, if it failed, because the Hanagas HaMishpat suddenly became so potential and so sensitive, if the Hanagas HaMishpat fails, right, what happens is, it falls back, and then Hanagas HaYichud suddenly sweeps up and takes up the vacuum, and brings in a much bigger tzorah than usual. There are certain periods in Klal Yisrael history when the potential for Achishena is even greater, which means that the Hanagas HaMishpat suddenly swells up and gives Klal Yisrael a much more possible potential event of bringing the Mashiach. These are the curves which represent, the larger curves and so on. Now, because of the fact that the Hanagas HaMishpat suddenly allows Klal Yisrael to bring the Mashiach with a greater ease than others, if Klal Yisrael would have succeeded, it would have brought Yemais Mashiach. However, during that period, if Klal Yisrael fails, then suddenly the Hanagas HaYichud takes up the vacuum in which the Hanagas HaMishpat created. You see, since the Hanagas HaMishpat created a very high possibility, when that possibility is lost, the Hanagas HaYichud then comes in and lowers it, which means that the tzorah is much greater. You see, the same potential that could have been for good is now used for tzorah. You see, because that's the Hanagas HaYichud. You see, Eitz Tzorah Yil Yaakov Umimenu V'Yeshaya. Either the Yeshua of Klal Yisrael comes because of Mishpat, because of Bechira, you see, or it comes because of Eitz Tzorah Yil Yaakov, you see. So therefore, in those periods, critical periods of Achishena, when Klal Yisrael can bring the Mashiach even more, when they fail to do it, the Hanagas HaYichud then takes up the vacuum, you see, and brings on a greater tzorah to Klal Yisrael in order to be mesaken against that kitruk, to move the kilkul that they brought in by not bringing the gula. But on a normal daily basis, there's always an Achishena. And every day that Klal Yisrael fails to bring the Mashiach, of course, the Hanagas HaYichud has to come in to take the place. So each day the Hanagas HaYichud is getting bigger and bigger, and the Hanagas HaMishpat is getting smaller and smaller. That's on the normal Achishena. You see, that's called the course of the Achishena. or the progression, the Achishena progression. You see. So the Achishena progression could be on a normal vein, on a day-to-day basis, and it functions on a day-to-day basis, and whenever the Hanagas HaMishpat fails, the Hanagas HaYichud comes in and takes up the slack.
Constant interfacing.
Yes, there's a constant interface. However, there are periods of time when the Achishena suddenly swells up, much greater, where there's a much bigger possibility for Klal Yisrael in terms of the potential to bring the Mashiach, and if they fail to do it, then it swells down again. But as it swells down, the Hanagas HaYichud takes up that entire opposite swelling, and therefore the tzora is much greater. But there's a constant interaction between the Hanagas HaMishpat and the Hanagas HaYichud in terms of the Achishena. And therefore, on a standard basis, the interaction is much smaller, you see. There's a small incremental thing where the Hanagas HaYichud gets bigger and bigger, and the Hanagas HaMishpat gets smaller and smaller. But in those periods of Achishena which are special, where there's a greater potential Mashiach to come, then the Hanagas HaMishpat suddenly swells up to a much greater degree. So that when it fails, suddenly the Hanagas HaYichud swells up to a much larger degree to take up that slack. That more or less is the progression of the Achishena. Basically, we covered the concepts of the purpose of the emergent Mashiach itself as it relates to the various phases of the world, the emergent and the emergent Mashiach. And we have, I think, a better understanding of the concept of the emergent Mashiach, how it relates to the two tikkunim itself. And we also have understanding now in terms of the process of the emergent Mashiach, how it's to arrive, in terms of the concept of Be'ita or Be'achishena, in terms of, first of all, how it relates to the Hanagas HaMishpat and the Hanagas HaYichud, and how the course of the Achishena progression itself changes, in terms of standard progressions, and in terms of special times when the Achishena becomes much more potential. But it leaves us with a better understanding in terms of what the emergent Mashiach is, and how it's to be arrived at. What I'd like to talk to you about today is what will the emergent Mashiach look like? Some of the important characteristics of the emergent Mashiach. Now, up to now we've discussed the concept of the union of Mashiach itself in terms of the processes, the Mashiach ben David process, the Mashiach ben Yosef process, where it came from, these processes, its connection to other mission. We spoke about the Mashiach in every generation, the concept of Shoshim, the concept of the Yechida, the Melech HaMashiach. This thing we spoke about also the notion of what the emergent Mashiach actually is, in terms of the repetition of the Matzav of Adam Rishon Kodem Achet. And we spoke about what happens about the emergent Mashiach when it takes a long time, in terms of how much kilkul it's removed and how much Chasson it removes. We also spoke about the ways the emergent Mashiach, the Ito, the Achishena. We spoke about all these different things. What I'd like to speak about now is the emergent Mashiach itself. What will it look like? What's going to happen in the emergent Mashiach? I am not going to discuss how it's going to come about yet. That will leave for a future share. Right now what I want to discuss is, what is the emergent Mashiach itself? What can we expect? What will that period basically look like? When we finish that, after that, the next topic after this, we shall discuss the Mashiach himself. What the Psukim tell us about his personality, the kind of person that he is, his tachlis, how exactly, he becomes Mashiach. What we can know from Chazal and from the Nevi'im, and what we can figure out from Hashkafa B'chlal about all these Nyanim. And then finally we have the last thing is, how will the entire Messianic process occur? How will it happen? We're going to take all our information and put it together to find out step by step the whole series of events that basically will occur. So, having gotten through all the stuff, it should be very, very instructive in terms of this. The fundamental characteristic of the emergent Mashiach is the concept of Gili Yechudai. As we said last time, the emergent Mashiach is a period when there is basically a tremendous amount of Gili Yechudai. What do we mean by Gili Yechudai? It means that the knowledge and understanding of the Bnei Shalom will be such that all people will know that there exists a God, and that his and the way he exists, his midas, many different things will be clearly understood by all people. You see this in the Pasuk very clearly. There are many psukim that say this. The Pasuk that we refer to as Umola Oretz Deis Hashem Kamayim L'Yom Mechasem, and the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of Hashem, of the Bnei Shalom, as the waters cover the sea. Vahi Hashem lemelech akol ha'oretz bayom ahu yechad Hashem echad u'shmo echad. Many psukim that attest to the fact and tell us that the fundamental characteristic of the Yemais Mashiach will be the tremendous Gil Yehuda that will exist then. Now, that Gil Yehuda will not only be by the Jews, it will be by the Goyim too. Every Goy, whether that Goy lives in Germany or that Goy lives in Russia, every Goy and so on, who was a Kaifa before and so on, so everyone who lives at that time will believe in the Bnei Shalom with absolute certainty. There no longer will be any other religion besides the Torah. Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, all these things will disappear from the face of the earth. You see, there will only exist one thing, which is the emunah in the Bnei Shalom himself, and the understanding of the tachlis of the Bria, of what a Jew is, and how the Jew connects to the tachlis of Bria. This will be clearly understood by every person who will live at that time. It's an incredible thing, considering the fact that the Jews are the smallest of the nations, they're the smallest of the religions, in a certain sense. The Goyim rule the world, they have the power, and they have all the chokhmah, many things and so on. It's an incredible thing to realize that there will come a time when it will be the Jews and their understanding of the world, the Bnei Shalom, the Malchus, the Hashem HaMelech. The Malchus will belong to the Bnei Shalom over the entire world. And it's an amazing thing that such a period will someday come to pass. Now, this is the fundamental characteristic of the Yemais Mashiach. Now, as we said last time, the Madrega of the Yemais Mashiach will probably be greater than the Madrega of other Mishin Kodim Achad. Because not only will all the Kilkul or Zoyama of the Bria have been removed, but the Bria will have been lifted also, a very great Madrega in terms of removing the Chesaron of the Bria. It will have been lifted to a very high Madrega of Shlemus as well. You see. Now, according to that, it means that the world will be in the Madrega of the Nachash. Nachash meaning similar to the Madrega of other Mishin Kodim Achad, not in the Madrega of the Zoyam of the Nachash. You see. But the Nachash that will exist, or the Yetzer Hara that will exist in the time of the Yemais Mashiach, will be much smaller than the Yetzer Hara which existed at the time of other Mishin Kodim Achad. You see. Why? Because since the Yemais Mashiach will be a period which will have established a great deal of Shleimus already, you see, so then the Yetzer Hara will be much smaller. By other Mishin Kodim Achad, the world had no Shleimus at all. It was completely Chesaron. It had no Kilkul, but it was complete Chesaron also. So, at that time, because of the Chesaron, the Yetzer Hara was in the form of a Nachash, with a certain ability and certain strength. But in the Yemais Mashiach, not only will the Kilkul be removed, but the world will be also at a very high Madrega of Shleimus already, much more than other Mishin Kodim Achad. So therefore, the Yetzer Hara which remains will be much smaller than the Yetzer Hara which existed in the time of other Rishon before the Chet. But there will be a Yetzer Hara. There still will be a small amount of Yetzer Hara left. Therefore, there will still be a certain amount of Bechira. This is very important to realize, that in the Yemais Mashiach will still have Bechira. It will still be subservient to the Tachlis of Nam Sufa, the Tikkun of Nam Sufa. But fundamentally, the entire thing will be in the process of the Mashiach ben David. You see, it is the process of the Mashiach ben David who arises in that time, the Yemais Mashiach, to remove finally the complete Nachash, once and for all, so that he ushers in the period called Olam Haba. You see, the Yemais Mashiach is the last period of Olam Haba, and that period is to totally, finally, completely remove the whole Indian of the Nachash, or the whole Indian of the Satan, and the Sitla Acha, or the Yetzer Hara. By the end of the Yemais Mashiach, there will no longer exist a Yetzer Hara. Absolutely. You see. At the beginning of the Yemais Mashiach, there will no longer be a Zoyama of the Nachash. There will no longer be a Kilkul in the Bria, but there will be a Nachash. There will be a certain aspect of Bechira, a certain aspect of the Tikkun of Nam Sufa. There's a little bit yet left to go to finish it up before Olam Haba. But that's the Tachlis fundamentally Yemais Mashiach. It's the last climax. To finish off, it's a Makabah Patish. To finish off the last job, or the last amount of Tikkun of Nam Sufa, which is necessary before the final Indian of Olam Haba starts. But in any case, the critical principle in the Yemais Mashiach is that there will be a Yetzer Hara. There will be. But it will be a very small Yetzer Hara. It will not be any Zoyama, an expanded Yetzer Hara, where there's a Kilkul. It will be a Nachash in that sense, but it'll be a small Yetzer, but it'll be much smaller than the Nachash of Adam Rishon. Yeah. Oh. Because of the fact that the Yetzer will be very small in that kind of sense, that means there will be what's called a tremendous tiburis of Kedusha. The world will be filled with Kedusha, tremendous Kedusha, and all the presence of Kedusha and so on, in that kind of way. Now, that means that every Jew will become will have a very high neshama, a very powerful neshama. Now, as we explained before, the Yechida comes down on the Mashiach and crowns the Mashiach, and that's how he becomes a Mashiach. And what will also happen is that every Jew in Klal Yisrael will also get a piece of that Yechida. You see, the relationship between the Yechida of the Mashiach and the Yechida to all Klal Yisrael is the following. Adam Rishon, before the Chet, his neshama included all neshamas after the Chet. Right? Now because of the Chet, his neshama was fragmented into all the other people who would then live on after him. So what he failed to do would now have to be done by all his fragments, the tzutzim of what used to be that one neshama of Adam Rishon. However, there was one neshama that was never fragmented because it never came down. That was the Yechida. The Yechida was the fifth part of that neshama, which represented the highest level of Ruchnius, the highest existential plane, and that never came down on Adam because he failed. He never became the Mashiach. So that stood where it was. But in the emergent Mashiach, when that comes down, it comes down in full force. It's a complete collective Yechida. What Adam should have had comes down on the Mashiach. That's a very heavy load to bring it home. And through that one neshama, I'm not clear exactly the mechanism, but it's split in a sense. It's not exactly split, but there's a certain aspect of it's splitting, and it goes to every Jew in Klal Yisrael, gets a piece of Yechida. You see. But in some way, that Yechida is still connected to the main Yechida, which is on the Mashiach. You see. So what happens is all of Klal Yisrael becomes, in a certain sense, connected to the Yechida of the Mashiach. Every Jew in Klal Yisrael gets the Yechida itself. You see. But those all Yechidas somehow are connected to the main Yechida which the Mashiach has. You see. So as the Yechida, his Yechida, the Mashiach's Yechida, is massive things, those Hasagas begin to go to all of Klal Yisrael. You see. So that's what happens. First the Chachma goes down on the Mashiach, and then it's Nispasha to all Klal Yisrael through the Mashiach. That's why it's impossible to bring the Geula without the Mashiach. He's the funnel and the central generating station for all the Hasagas, Hasgili Yechudai and Hasagas Yechudai, that will go to all of Klal Yisrael at that time. The oil first comes down on him, and from him it goes to all of Klal Yisrael. Constantly, in that fashion. You see. But that means also that all of Klal Yisrael will become Nevi'im. Everyone will become a prophet. Everyone. Every man, woman, or child will become a Navi. Automatically, without any effort whatsoever. So that small children will be Niznabe. All kinds of chokhmas, and they'll see things in the future, and they'll see, they'll know things, tremendous chokhmas, without any effort at all. You see, why? Because since the Yetzer Hara is out of the Bria in the sense that he's much smaller, see, so the Kedusha now fills the world. But when Kedusha fills the world, it means that the neshama of every Jew now is very powerful. It has full force of Kedusha. So the Kochas HaNefesh are tremendous in every Jew's neshama. Well, those kind of Kochas HaNefesh are Kochas that have to do with Nevi'us. So therefore every Jew will become a Navi. Everyone. And that will be the distinction of a Jew at that time. Goyim will not become Nevi'im. But what will clearly differentiate a Jew from everyone else in the world is that the Jews will become Nevi'im. People will also live much longer. They will live long lives. You see. Why? Because the whole Indian of Misa is the Indian of the Yetzer Hara. But at that time, Yetzer Hara, the force, the Koach of the Satan, and the Tumah will be very, very small. So the corresponding lives of a person will be very long. You see, people will live long time. They will no longer be like you feel now. Everyone, however, has to die. Everyone does have to die. Because that's the Gzera and Adam Rishon. There's only 4 people that ever escaped that Gzera. Eliyahu Hanavi, Yaina, Terach Basasa, and Chanoich. These are 4 that escaped the Gzera of Misa. But everyone else in the Bria always has to die. And everyone in the Image Mashiach will also have to die. I'm not clear, I suspect very strongly that the Mashiachim themselves do not die. That they themselves do not die. because they are the main ones who hold the Yechida, and the Yechida was never part of Adam Rishon as he sinned, so it never took in the Zoyama that Adam took him. The Yechida is free of the Zoyama, and since it's free of the Zoyama, it's free, I think, of the Gzera, of Misa, on Adam. I'm not clear on that. There's a possibility to say that the Tvei Mashiach never die, but I'm not clear exactly if that's how definite that is. There is a possibility, since they hold the Yechida so closely to them, it's so integrated to them. The Yechida has no Zoyama from Adam Rishon and has nothing to do with Misa. So, but they have other Chalakim as well. So whether or not they die is not clear. But all other Jews will have to die. Everyone will have to die at least a minute or two, at least an hour, Shah Achas, before Olam Haba. You see, to get rid of the Zoyama, to get the Zichuk, so that the body deteriorates quickly, and the Zoyama goes out of it, and the body is then reconstructed by Tchias HaMesim. You can't have Tchias HaMesim until you first have Mesim. You see, so therefore everyone has to die. Another important feature of the Moshe Mashiach will be that all the Jews will be back in Eretz Yisrael, and they will all live in Eretz Yisrael. That's called Kibbutz Goliath, or the ingathering of all the exiles. The Eretz Yisrael at the time of the Moshe Mashiach will probably be the Eretz Yisrael of the biblical times.
What can it called?
Before it was divided and conquered. But the biblical borders which constitute Eretz Yisrael will be the Eretz Yisrael of the Moshe Mashiach.
The one they have.
Every Jew will go. Every Jew will go to Eretz Yisrael and live in Eretz Yisrael, and Yerushalayim will become the capital of Eretz Yisrael and the capital of the world. Why? Because at that time the Kedusha will be centralized in Eretz Yisrael. All the Kedusha and the main Uris that will have to do with the Yemot Mashiach, the Uris of the Mashiach, will be in Eretz Yisrael. So every Jew will run to Eretz Yisrael. It's not like he wants to stay behind. There will be nothing behind. All the first and the Oiz, and all the Simcha, and all the Torah will be in Eretz Yisrael. Who wants to stay behind? You see. Even the Goyim will be banging down to get in Eretz Yisrael, but they won't be able to, because they have to live in their own lands. But Eretz Yisrael will be the place to be. Also, there will be the third Beit HaMikdash. The third Beit HaMikdash will be in Yerushalayim and so on. So fundamentally, we have a world with the following characteristics. We have a world which is Molei Das Hashem, Molei Kedusha. All the Jews will be back in Eretz Yisrael. There will be a Beit HaMikdash. Yerushalayim will become the capital of the world. All the Chochmah and all the Kedusha will be in Yerushalayim. All the Jews who live then will live long lives, and they will all be Zerchet to Nevi'us outright without any effort whatsoever. The Yetzer will be very small, but there will be still some Bechira left. But what is very critical to realize when we say that the Yetzer will be very small, and this is something that's very hard to understand, all the typhus that we experience today will be gone, as we know them. You see, sinner, kinner, all these things, gaiva, all these things that are part of human condition, many of the typhus, all these things will have disappeared, and there will only be very, very little of this left, which means that for all practical purposes, we will be different people. You see, with a different nature. A completely different nature. So the mind of the Yemot Mashiach will be the fact that there's tremendous Kedusha and tremendous Toiv and tremendous Simcha. But the Chesron of the Yemot Mashiach is the fact that there's very little Bechira. So therefore there's very little opportunity to be kinda Nuscha. There will be very, in terms of the mitzvahs and so on. And therefore the ability to get tremendous Chah of Olam Haba will be gone. There will be no real Nisyanis at that time. Very few Nisyanis. So the ability to acquire a great chelik in Olam Haba will no longer be there. There will be no more Indian of Bala Chuvas. There will be no more Indian of people who are not from anymore. There are no more Indian of all these things. There will not even be any Indian of tzaddikim anymore. That's the problem, you see. You will not have to look far for a tzaddik. Everyone will be a tzaddik. V'amech kulam tzaddikim at that time, you see. So therefore there's no more distinction in becoming a tzaddik, you see. There's no Indian of a tzaddik in the Yemot Mashiach. There's only a tzaddik Yemot Mashiach, but everyone's going to be a tzaddik. So the possibility or the potential of the person becoming a tzaddik will be lost. And this shows you a very, very important thing. A very, very important thing in terms of avoida, sama hashkafa. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, it's a Gemara in Yerushalmi, I think in Peah. He says that be very, very careful in a generation which does not learn a lot of Torah. In a generation which ignores a great deal of Torah and the mitzvahs, you make sure that you are shomer Torah mitzvahs very much. Why? Because since no one else is doing it, and you're doing it, you'll be noitel tzcha kulam. you will take the schar of everyone, in that sense. Now, it's my personal belief that this is such a time. Since the time of Adam Rishon, since the time out of Avraham Avinu, I don't believe there has ever been a more incredible opportunity in which to get huge halakim of Olam Haba as there is now. And there never again will be. Because at the time of Avraham Avinu, only Avram was Osik in Kedusha. The entire world was fundamentally Osik in Tumah. So therefore, Avram did all these things and he was able to be koina to mend his chelik. Now, what happened to the chelik of all the other people? Where did it go? You see, the answer is, it went to Avram. So therefore, he was Tzchakula. He took not only his own chelik, but he took the chelik that should have gone to all these other people, since they discarded it. So therefore, even though it was a very difficult period for Avram, but it was also a period of fabulous opportunity. I believe that we are now on the threshold of exactly the same kind of opportunity. In this Ikut Mashiach, where many people are not from, unfortunately, and Torah is really not considered that important. If you occupy yourself tremendously now, you will be making schar of many people who will not be in that kind of thing. So now is the possibility of getting a tremendous chelik in Olam Haba more than, let's say, 200 years ago, or 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago. Much more. You see. It's now, for example, let's say it's the example is given, for example, with diamonds, where there are diamonds all over the street and nobody really wants them. It is your opportunity now to pick up all these gems, so that later on when it comes to Olam Haba, you are a tremendous amount of this wealth. Because no one else really wants it. So this is what we have now. This period of Ikut Mashiach. It is the last opportunity to grab what everyone else is really not grabbing. And also, it's the last opportunity to be a tzaddik, or to even work on these things, or Yir Shemayim. Because when that Moshe Mashiach comes around, that's it. There's no more tshuva, and there's no more tzaddikim, as we know it. This is the last period in all of human history, when being a tzaddik means something. Now, how will this period come about? If we understand what the characteristics are of Yir Mashiach, fundamentally, how does this period come about? Okay, the way this period basically comes about is very different than the way the first Gula happened. In the first Gula, the Gula of Mitzrayim, of Yetzias Mitzrayim, what happened over there? How was the Gili Yehuda established? Fundamentally, the Gili Yehuda of Yetzias Mitzrayim was established through Nisim. Moshe Rabbeinu went ahead and did tremendous Nisim with the Koyach of the Baruch Shalom. He did the Hasora Makas, he did Kriyas Yamsuf, and so on. Now, while those nisim was happening, there was an open Gili Yehuda, wasn't there? Complete Gili Yehuda. So what it was is that there was an eruption in the Teva, which in Regala the Yichud of the Baruch Shalom. At that point, it was a period of Gili Yehuda, and no Jew could do an Avera while those nisim were going on, because the Gili Yehuda was so powerful and so obvious. But there's a chasor to that method. The chasor to that method is the following. Is that the Gili Yehuda only exists as long as the nest is going on. As soon as the nest stops, and Teva goes back to where it is, the Yetzer again comes back in and says, well, wait a minute, how do you know what you saw? Maybe it was just your faulty memory and this and that and so on. And you can forget, you see. So a nest, to be Megali Yehuda in the Bria by a nest, is an inferior method. It's an inferior method. The method which Moshe Rabbeinu used and which was done by Yetzias Mitzrayim was really an inferior method. The method of Gili Yehuda by the time of the Mashiach will be different. The Gili Yehuda will not be brought in through Nisim really, but the main way the Gili Yehuda will be brought in is through Chochmah, through understanding. The Mashiach will bring in a Chochmah, an understanding, a das into the world, where people will understand the existence of God. They will not just see it by some miracle or some deviation from the natural order. They will understand the Yad Hashem, because they will understand exactly how the Baruch Hashem does everything He does in the Bria, in terms of the history of mankind, with their Chachma, with their understanding. You see, if you recall, we said that the main way that the Yetzer functions is not through the Taiva, but by being Master Yehudai, through the Das. What the Yetzer does is through the senses, through Chush, you see, by the cover-up of the senses, and by Teva, a natural law, and by Mikra, by the accidental appearance in life. The Yetzer attempts to convince you that there is no ultimate force in the Bria. There's no rhyme or reason of anything. You see, there is no Yad Hashem. So that's essentially how the Yetzer works. However, in the Mashiach, the Mashiach will be regarded the Chochmah of the Baruch Shalom, and such, so that every person will no longer, you see, believe in sensation, or Teva, or Mikra, in all. but that every Jew will believe and understand exactly how the Baruch Shem exists in the world, what his Meisim was, how he ran history, how he guided history so that it should achieve its ultimate tachlis. And with this clear-cut understanding, there will no longer be the possibility of the Yetzer Hara to come and really deceive a person in the way he did before. Now that kind of Gili Yehuda is permanent. You see, Gili Yehuda which comes to a nest is an eruption in the teva of that Gili Yehuda. However, the Gili Yehuda which the Mashiach will bring will be a superior one, because it will be an erosion, not an eruption. It will be an erosion, you see, of the Hester, not an eruption of the Hester in that sense. The Mashiach will erode the Hester and completely destroy it. He will completely destroy it because of the Chachma that he will be Megala to the world at that time. So fundamentally, the Gilu Yehuda that took place by Mitzrayim, by Yetzias Mitzrayim, was through Nisim, or miracles. And it constitutes an eruption in the Hester, in the world. But as soon as the Nisim are gone, as soon as the Teva is restored, the Hester comes back and remains. The distinguishing factor about the Gili Yehuda that will come as Man Mashiach, as we say, is that the Mashiach will introduce a new level of das, of understanding. His main activity will not be through Nisim, although that will occur. But his use of the matter. See, the Mashiach will have the matter just like Moshe had also. Moshe Rabbeinu had the staff, and with that staff he was able to produce Nisim. The Mashiach will use the matter to produce das, or Chochmah. And as he produces das, in the sense that he's Megala into the world, a tremendous level of Gili Yichud about the existence and the koyach of the Baruch Shem, the world will come to a new level of understanding, such that the Hester itself will begin to leave permanently. That's why the Gili Yichud that the Mashiach will bring into the world will be permanent, whereas the Gili Yichud that Moshe brought into the world was really not able to be permanent, and it was really of an inferior quality in a certain sense. But that the Gili Yichud that the Mashiach will bring in through the Chochmah will remove all Hester from the world, and thus the Yetzer Hara or the Sitra Achra can no longer function. The certain, in order to function, must have Hester or concealment, or else he can't function. Remember, through perception, through Teva and through Mikra, Chush, Teva and Mikra, through sense perception, through natural law, and through the apparent randomness of the events in a person's life. Without these different disguises, it is impossible for a person to really truly have Bechira towards Ra, you see. And when the Mashiach will do it, remove that Hester that comes from these three items, basically, and therefore the Yetzer Hara will not be able to function as an antagonistic force to Kedusha, basically. And as such, the Yetzer Hara must begin to lift from the Bria. His roots, or his raglayim, his feet are cut off. That's why the Gilui that the Mashiach will bring is greater than the Gilui that Moshe brought in the beginning. Let's more closely look at the difference between the understanding that comes, the awareness of Gili Yichud that comes from a Nes versus the Gili Yichud that comes from Chochmah. A Nes is a disturbance in Teva. So what happens is, when a person sees a Nes, he sees clearly that Teva is not self-regulatory or automatic unto itself, but that obviously there is a hand behind that the Baruch Shem is mashgiach the world behind that. But he doesn't understand how the Baruch Shem interconnects with Teva. He doesn't understand how the Baruch Shem interacts with Teva and produces Teva. He doesn't understand that. He just sees it obviously in front of him, what's called empirically, that the Baruch Shem is the one who controls Teva. But the interface with what the Baruch Shem to Teva is not understood. So as soon as Teva is restored, then the Baruch Shem's presence is gone, fundamentally. So then you may say, well, the person obviously remembers, then it's based on memory. He remembers that there was a nest. But over time that memory becomes weak, and so on. And the full impact begins to lose. You see, the impact becomes lost, you see. Because it's not based on Chochmah. It's just based on a perceptual event, something you saw and realized, but you didn't understand really what you were seeing. But Chochmah is a different thing. When you begin to understand what Teva is in terms of its panemius and how the Baruch Shem guides Teva, you see, in terms of the basic principles involved, you could never again be deceived. Because whether there's teva or not, it's irrelevant. You understand clearly what the inner mechanisms of teva is. You see, and exactly how it works and why it works the way it does. So whether there's a nest or there's not a nest, it doesn't matter. You understand the inner behavior, the inner mechanism of natural law itself. You see. So it has nothing to do with the appearance or disappearance of a nest. It forever remains in your mind, and it's not based on memory. It's based on clear havana and hasaga. And that lasts permanently. The question can be asked, well, a nest is dramatic in terms of its what it instructs us, or in terms of its revelation. But Chokhmah is not as dramatic, you see. But the answer is that the Chokhmah of the Mashiach, the Urish Mashiach, is far more dramatic than a nest. That is the unique quality of the Oragonas, you see. It's the unique quality of the Oragonas. That when that light comes down and that understanding becomes known, it will be so staggering to the person that it will have the same dramatic effect as a nest. That is the nature of that awe. Again, to answer this question about the awe of the Mashiach, why it will be so powerful and dramatic, is the following: is that the important distinction or the important principles of science are such that when science understands certain laws of nature and they produce a theory, we say that that theory is true if it can predict something new in reality. You see. For example, the theory of the electron and the electronics is all very critical, and we know to a large extent that it's true because we have devices which work on those principles, like tape recorders, for example. A tape recorder, the entire circuitry of a tape recorder is built on the theory of electrons. So in other words, a theory which is true, a theory which truly explains reality, will affect reality in a sense that it can predict certain things about reality. It has empirical justification as well. That will be the importance of the Chokhmah that the Mashiach will give to the world. That when he explains, you see, when he explains the nature of reality, the nature of Teva, and the nature mostly of the Hashkocha Protis, you will have that kind of understanding which will allow you to actually predict what will happen subsequently. And you will be able to explain many, many things that were totally incomprehensible. But there will be a certain aspect, literally, of prediction. And it will be able to actually affect certain things in reality itself. That's how you will know that that Chokhmah is true. It's not just a theory. And this is the fundamental feature of the Urish Mashiach, the Chokhmah of the Mashiach. What I would like to discuss now is, what is the nature of that Chokhmah? Fundamentally. What exactly fundamentally is the nature of that Chokhmah that the Mashiach is going to be Megala in the Yemais Mashiach? What I'd like to do is to, right now, discuss something about the Urish Mashiach. But the truth of the matter is, we cannot understand the Urish Mashiach until we have an understanding of much more fundamental principles. And if you really look at the entire situation, there is something going on in the entire Bria which really is very elusive, but it is very, very pivotal, and it is the very essence of the Mashiach ben Yosef. The entire Indian of the Mashiach ben Yosef stands on it, and also the 12 Mashiachim, but the Ikka is the Mashiach ben Yosef. And from this we'll begin to understand the connection between the Mashiach ben Yosef, Moshe Rabbeinu, and Moshe Rabbeinu. And later on we'll go into different other aspects and so on. Let's start from the beginning again, like we always do. Adam Rishon. Again, Adam Rishon Chedim Achet, our favorite character. And of course, I've explained this many times why we always go with Adam Rishon, because
we're all part of him.
We're part of him, but fundamentally, he was the Tachlis of the Bria. I mean, hypothetically or initially, he was the Tachlis of the Bria. So everything can be seen from Adam. Adam Rishon was given one mitzvah. He's given one mitzvah. Now, that mitzvah was Lo Yisrich Al Mana Eitz. You should not eat from the Eitz Hadas. One mitzvah. After he did the Chet, and we've explained this many, many times, that if he had performed that mitzvah, right, the oil would have come down from the Shemayim, right? It would have been Mavi as Neshama, as the Neshama would have become very, very powerful, and it would have been Mezachich the Guf, right? And it would have raised the entire Bria to a level of Olam Haba. And that would have been the Ora, really that's the Or HaGonas. He would have then been Zeicha to this new Or called the Or HaGonas, which the Or Mashiach, in this case it would have been Or of Or Mashiach through the Yechida. We explained this before. Adam failed, and therefore, after he failed, and therefore this one mitzvah became 7 mitzvahs, which are called the Shiva Mitzvah B'nai Noach. So where there used to be 1 mitzvah of Adam Mishin Kodim Echet, there are now 7. The interesting question is, why? What's going on over here? First there's 1, then there's 7. I'm not going to go into detail. I will go later on. Later on, we're going to examine not only why there was 1 mitzvah by Adam, but why that mitzvah was achila, is achila. And later on, the mitzvahs split out into different fashions. You see, we're going to go into more detail. But we're not going to go into that now. In the Yutzat Shir, we'll have some mention of this. We're going into some very important aspects of it. So this is an important Hakdama for that. Now, with Noach, there was an introduction of 7 mitzvahs. Well, actually, it was from Adam after the Chet. But Noach is the one who institutionalized it, as we may say, after the Mabul, because it was a new order. At the time of Matan Torah, after Yetzias Mitzrayim, Moshe Rabbeinu gave Klal Yisrael Tayag mitzvahs, 613. Prior to the Tayag mitzvahs, there were only 7. The 613 mitzvahs are supposed to last until the times of Mashiach. The Tayag mitzvahs, which were given to us by the Baruch Hashem through Moshe, are supposed to go into the Yemot Mashiach itself until the end of the Yemot Mashiach. Now, the Torah that will exist at the time of the Yemot Mashiach is not exactly the same as the Torah that was existed before. Some of the mitzvahs will no longer be chal, or they'll be chal in a different surah. I'm not clear exactly on the transformation, but the Torah will not be exactly the same. And we'll go into that in a minute. Now, all these 4 people, Adam, Noach, Moshe, and Mashiach ben Yosef, all have something in common. They all represent a certain specific status with regard to the mitzvahs. Not only that, but all of them, in a certain sense, represented the introduction to those level of mitzvahs. Where Adam introduced, well, I should say, he was the one that was the subject of the first mitzvah. Noach was the subject of the 7 mitzvahs and introduced the 7 mitzvahs. Moshe is Tayag mitzvahs, and so on. And the Mashiach ben Yosef finishes off in Yom Mashiach with a different number of mitzvahs, or a different number of mitzvahs, or a different surah. What they all have in common is the fact that they all relate to this aspect of Torah. Now, I would like to ask a number of questions here. First of all, there's a message that says that Avram Avinu knew all the Tayag mitzvahs. Not only did he know the Tayag mitzvahs, but he also knew the Rabbanan. He knew the Erev Tafshirin. That's what it says. Now the question is, where did Avram know this from? Only Moshe introduced it. You needed the Nevuah of Moshe to do it. How did Avram Avinu know what the Tayag mitzvahs are? And even if he did know it, how did he know what Erev Tafshirin, which is the Rabbanan? Medivus that was enacted way later on. Where did he come to this information? He didn't have the Nevi'us of Moshe. And we know clearly that Moshe was the greatest of all Nevi'im. And you can only give the Torah with the Nevi'us of Moshe. You have to have that Nevi'us in order to qualify for that kind of thing. You see, where did Avram get this information? Not only that, if Avram knew the Tayag mitzvahs, if that was the case, so then why did Moshe megala them? You see, why did Moshe megala them and let them just be passed down from generation to generation from Avram, which in certain ways they were? Oh, now we know, right, when Avram knew the Tayag mitzvahs and he kept them, but he was an Ein Mitzvah, he didn't have to keep them. It was voluntary on his part. Now, even though it was voluntary, Avram still got a schar. We know that. Because an Ein Mitzvah also gets schar. Except that an Ein Mitzvah is not as great as a Mitzvah. Somebody who's commanded to do the mitzvahs because he's a Mitzvah is greater than an Ein Mitzvah who does it voluntarily. For example, if a woman puts on tefillin, she still gets a mitzvah. She gets a certain schar. Except that she's an Ein Mitzvah because she wasn't commanded to put on tefillin. But she can do it, and she will get schar. Now, if a man puts on tefillin, he gets the schar of a mitzvah, which is greater than hers. Why? Because when he thinks he has a mitzvah, there's a yetzer hara involved, which he has to battle. So therefore, he has a greater capacity to earn schar, the masakanam mitzvah. We went into this before. Avon kept tayag mitzvahs as an ein mitzvah. You see, not as a mitzvah. So obviously there was a schar in that kind of sense. There's another question I would like to ask, and this question is the following. What is the whole inyan of a Rabbanan? Where does the Rabbanan come from? The fact that we have to listen to the Chachamim who make Zeres is in the Torah itself. Ushmatim es mishmati, and so on. Loisosim medivreim, and so on. It is specific mitzvahs, it's a mitzvah's essay min Torah to listen to the Chachamim of that generation who make Zeres and Dakonis. You see? Which means that it's a device to listen to the Rabbanan. And there's a machlokes rishonim, if you're over the Rabbanan, if you're over the Raisa or not, and so on. Now, the problem is the following. Why is such a case? Why did the Torah have to come and say that we ourselves, the Torah says, I authorize the Chachamim to give you, to make Zeres? Why? Let the Chachamim make the Zeres on their own. Not in terms of Zera, but in terms of an Eitzah Teva. For example, the Chachamim would say, if you want to be a Yir Shemayim, and if you want to obtain Olam Haba, the following is a recommended path. It's an Eitzah. It's an Eitzah HaYe'utah. It's a sagely advice, and so on. So therefore, if you want to listen to the Chachamim, fine. You know, if you don't want to listen to them, you don't listen to them. But it's, you know, it's at your risk, and so on. But why is it that if you don't listen to the Chachamim, you're overlapped? What, you know, why did the Torah have to back him up for? Obviously, the Chachamim were so intelligent and so sagacious that they could make Zeres and Dakonis. We should listen to them from their Chacham alone, because it's tremendous advice.
Get bigger markets by Rabbanan.
So the question is, what is the importance of Chachamim that it needs the support of a Deraisa? Let it just be advice or suggestions.
So again with the same thing, right?
Now that we also know that the Rabbanan cannot come, the Chachamim cannot come along and they cannot make a new mitzvah. There's only 630 mitzvahs. The Chachamim cannot make 614, or they cannot make 612. They have no koyach to either add or subtract a mitzvah. They don't have this koyach. So obviously they can't introduce anything new in the Tayag mitzvahs. All they can do is simply tell us the best way. For example, Kriya Shema. According to the Torah, Kriya Shema has to be said at night and in the morning. The time limit of the night, the time's duration that you can say it at night is until the morning. You're allowed to say Kriya Shema of Avos until Shachris in the morning. Okay. But the Chachamim came along and they made a Gzera. They said that you should do it until Chatzos. Why? Because if you put it off after Chatzos, you'll probably go to sleep and you'll probably forget. Okay. It's nice advice. Okay. So the Chachamim should come along and say, we advise that everyone should say Kriya Shema of Avos before Chatzos. We advise that because you may wind up forgetting it. That's very nice advice. But when Chachamim say that you can't say it after Chatzos, it's the Rabbanan now that you're over. You see, if the Rabbanan take their koyach midiraisa, then it's much more severe. Why should that be? Their gezerus are simply eights. Why should that be? What do they really add to us? All they're trying to do is to make us better Jews. They're trying to help us out, keep the Torah itself, the Tayag mitzvahs. They're not making up the mitzvahs. The Banishim gave the Tayag mitzvahs. They're coming along and they're saying, we're going to help you out. We're going to give you the best information and the best suggestions which will make you into a Yir Shemayim. On that basis, we should receive their information. We either listen to them or we don't listen to them. But the question remains, why is the Rabbanan so important that it needs a device as a support itself? The Banishim made Tayag mitzvahs. Those Tayag mitzvahs are obligatory on us. And that should be it. When the Chachamim come along and they make Zeres, they're simply giving us their advice on the best way to keep those mitzvahs, as a Rebbe would give to his Talmud. That's all. Why should it have a stronger significance than that? We already have Tayag mitzvahs. How much more do you want to be Moisef in Tayag mitzvahs? I mean, if you can go on, we can go on to hundreds of thousands of mitzvahs, really, if you're going to really want to begin to do this. So the question is, what is the importance of the Rabbanan? The answer to these questions fundamentally really lie at the beginning. Adam Rishon was given one mitzvah. Now, Adam was given one mitzvah. That mitzvah was lo yitzrech al min eitz hadas. You shouldn't eat from the eitz hadas. Now, what exactly do we mean by a certain, like he was given this one mitzvah. The fact that Adam Rishon had to eat, you see, had nothing to do with a mitzvah. It has nothing to do with the mitzvah, the fact that he has to eat. Eating is a part of the guf. It has nothing to do with the something. A person lives in a guf, his body, and he has certain physical desires, he has certain physical necessities in order to survive. One of those physical necessities is the necessity of eating. You see. So Adam therefore had the desire to eat. He had the cheshik, or the tzrichus of eating because of his guf. When the Buddhism said that don't eat from the Eitz Hadas, something happened to that desire to eat, which is very unique. The desire to eat, or the tzrichus of eating, became a vehicle for the entire nisoyan that Adam had of either accepting God's will or rejecting it. What do we mean? We mean the following. We mean that the hashpor of the Satan, the koyach of the Satan, was in the taiva of eating, it was in the tzrichus of eating itself. It was in the tzrichus, but only in the eating. In all the other physical necessities of Adam Rishon, there was no Yetzer Hara. He had other necessities, of course. He did have other necessities, but they had no Yetzer Hara. They simply were desires of the guf that he had to fulfill just to survive. You see, as part of the nature of the guf, the type of substance of the guf. But eating was different than all other tzrichusim, in the sense that eating had the hashpor of the Satan in it, and since it had the hashpor of the Satan, it was able to be a nesoyan for him. Now, what do I mean by the hashpor of the Satan? It is very hard to understand the hashpor of the Satan in that achila itself. But fundamentally what it means is the following, is that this is what it means, that Adam, when he saw the Eitz Hadas, he had not just a need to eat from his body, he had a taiva to eat. The word taiva was much more powerful than the word tzrichus, or necessity. He wanted to eat from that Eitz Hadas in a very bad way. Why? Because he knew that to eat from the Eitz Hadas would make him feel better as a person, would make him feel powerful, would give him a whole sense of self as he ate from the Eitz Hadas. And he knew that in not eating from the Eitz Hadas, he would not be able to have that sense of self. In other words, the taiva of the Eitz Hadas, the eating of the Eitz Hadas, was infused, you see, with the added ego value, or value of self, that comes in with eating itself. That's very difficult to understand. Why? Because it no longer exists anymore in eating. However, it does exist in other areas, and I will bring another area to show exactly what I mean. The fundamental area where the Satan is mashpia on, in Adam Rishon Koydem Achet, was in Achila, was in the type of Achila, in regard to the Eitz Hadas. In other words, that one desire had in it the additional value of what it can do for the self. That if Adam ate from the Eitz Hadas, he would feel very powerful and really strong as a person in that sense. And if he didn't eat from the Eitz Hadas, he would not. In other words, through the time of Achila, the Yetzer was able to make Adam feel that he was his own man. Or in a certain sense, that his will was independent of God, of the Bnei Shalom, and he could do what he wants. And he would have the corresponding feeling of that as a result. You see. But the Yetzer was only able to do that in the taiva of Achila. That's why it was called a taiva. In all the other bodily functions, the Yetzer could not do it. When Adam did it, they were neutral to a sense of being, or a sense of self. But as far as the eating was concerned, to the Eitz Hadas, he felt something about that which was different than all his other physical necessities. Now, after the Chet of Adam Rishon, this feeling was no longer resided in the Achila anymore. It went to another area. It still exists in Achila to some degree, but it was no longer centrally focused. Where it went after the Achila was into a different taiva, and that taiva is the sexual taiva itself. Now, all of us exist on Adam Rishon Acha Achet. And because of that which Adam used to experience in Achila, we all experience in the sexual drive itself. Now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about the following. If I put, let's say, a delicious steak down, let's say, a God kosher rib steak, barbecued and so on, in front of you, right? And you're very hungry, right? And you sit down and you start eating that steak, and you finish the entire steak dinner. Do you feel better as a person? Do you feel like, wow, you feel something about yourself that you're much more choshev, more important as a person? No. You feel zat, that's all. You feel satiated. You see. But the sexual urge is very different. It's a very different. For example, if a man is able to seduce a stunning woman, you see, and he's able to seduce her, and he's able to have sexual relations with her, does that do something for his sense of self? Yes. Very differently. What does it make a person feel like? He feels suddenly that he really feels like a man. You see. He feels something about himself that he's never felt before. That there's something about his masculinity, about his own sense of self and his own sense of his own self-importance, which is really important. Now, the question is, why? Why is eating any different than the sexual function? They're both basically bodily functions. That's all they are. Yet we notice a very interesting thing. The exercise of one bodily function, eating, you see, only produces a certain hana in and of itself, eating. But the exercise of another bodily function, which is the sexual function, not only produces the hana of the sexual act itself, but it also produces a very powerful surge of one's own concept of oneself as well. You see. Now, whether or not you want to all admit this of yourself or not, you see. But if 5 women came up, for example, in your daily meetings, and all 5 women attempted to seduce you, by the time you went home at the end of the day, you would feel fantastic. Whether you want to admit it or not. Because if 5 women felt that you were that good looking or attractive or masculine, to all say, we want you, that would do something to your entire ego. It would, whether you want to admit it to yourself or not. And I'm not going to go into the personal, insights that each of you have about that. But it's a totally different thing than if someone put down 5 different steaks in front of you and you partook of it. It's a totally different thing. And I'm not only talking about the pleasure which is involved. I'm not talking about the concrete type of the thing. I'm talking about the significance that it has to the person's sense of self. You see. In fact, the biggest raya, if you look at the entire Goyish Welt, let's leave Yidden for a minute, and let's keep it there. Let's go to the Goyish Welt. The whole Goyish Welt rests on sexuality. Entirely. Look at the advertisements. When they sell cars, there's a beautiful woman sitting on the hood. Why is there a beautiful woman sitting on the hood? Or there's a man, for example. All these things, even though there may not be open sexual, connotations, but it's all subtle. The entire subtle message is, that somehow the connection that a man has to a woman, which is the sexual drive, is in some way connected with a person's sense of self, what they call macho in the vernacular. What exactly is macho in that sense? You ever see these guys walking along and they have these open shirts and they have these chains, or whatever the story in the West, this whole thing, the whole bodily projection, the entire bodily image, all of it is nothing more than a constant projection of sexuality, fundamentally. But when a man is walking down and he has a beautiful car, for example, and he drives down, in a beautiful car, and he's got the radio blasting and so on, and it's rock music on and so on, he feels great about himself. Why? What does all that have to do about his own sense of self? Because fundamental, all these things say, hey, you're really a sexual person. You're a man who can command the attention of all the females around. And that's what makes him feel good. He feels like a man. Now, where did this start from? This started from Adam Rishon Achar Chet. And this is exactly what Adam experienced in Achila before the Chet. You see, now you understand a little better. We can't understand is what drove Adam Rishon to eat from the Das. I mean, how can you get so hung up on a fruit, really, or on eating anything, The answer is, Adam Rishon was as hung up to eat that Das as a man has when he has a tremendously powerful urge and Taivas Nashim. You see, in the sense that he knows that when he fulfills that Taiva, he's going to feel totally different than himself. Now, what I mean is, of course, Adam Rishon's eating to make a das would not have produced the same effect. It's much lower after the Chet. I mean, I'm not being Madama. What I'm simply saying is the same, is the notion where a certain bodily function is invested with a certain sense of importance as it's fulfilled. That's what I'm saying. Of course, there's a very big difference. If Adam Rishon had eaten, the time that eaten the Eitz Das had certain similar aspects, but it was very different, it was much higher. But it still had the same thing. In other words, we see the very important thing, simply put, that there is a body which has certain physical necessities. When the Yetzer Hara is able to be mashpia through certain of those physical necessities, then what happens is that the completion or satisfaction of that physical necessity, which is invested with the Satan, brings gaiva to it. That's where it's at. A person can be misgoya from that taiva. But if the Yetzer Hara has no shaykh to that taiva, or that tzrichus, then the person cannot be misgoya, because there's no feel of gaiva for the thing. That's the whole zach. This is the Surya Dova, and this is a very, very subtle thing. When Adam had the first mitzvah of Achila, he knew that eating that mitzvah gives a certain feeling of gayus, a tremendous feeling of gayus. That was the exchange. Now the Yetzer Hara needs that, because he wants to make Adam feel like he can be a gaiva, you see, and not listen to the Bali Shalom. That's what he wants. But the Yetzer Hara, in order to function, needs a certain tzrichus of the guf. He needs a certain bodily need. He can't just come and say, hey, be a gaiva. This doesn't mean anything. What do you mean be a gaiva? He must come through the guf, through the chomris of the guf. You see, and through that chomris, he makes him feel like a gaiva. Now, this is much deeper than what I'm saying, and we'll go on to this in future shurim. But the basic idea is that. Now, in Adam Rishon before the Chet, all his bodily functions, including the sexual function before, and he had a sexual function, had no shaykhs to gaiva. Adam had a sexual function before. How do we know that? Because Chava was there, you see, and the sexual function at that time was simply a way to be mezdabik with Chava. The sexual act before Adam Rishon before the Chet was simply a way of expressing companionship. You see, companionship with Chava. That's really what it was. You see, but it was neutral. It has nothing to do with Gaiva. If Adam, it says, Loi Tov Yis Adam Levadoi. It's not good if man will be alone. So therefore, when Adam felt that he wanted to be with Chava, to express a certain need to be with another person through companionship, the Yoda did so, that that the sexual act would be an expression simply of companionship. But it had no element of Gaiva. The only thing that had this element of Gaiva was eating from the Eitz Das. You see. But in Adam Rishon, after the Chet, that Gaiva was transferred to a different bodily function. And the main bodily function was the sexual one. Now, why it was transferred to that one and not others is a total different shmulas. And we're not going to go into that. What? That's another thing. Why did it start with Achila? Why did it go to the sexual and tone? Is another thing. But the raya that we have, that it went to the sexual, besides the fact that we experienced that thing, is something even more subtle. The bris, the olah. Adam Rishon before the Chet had no olah. There was no foreskin. After the Chet of Adam Rishon, he had a foreskin. The foreskin over the Eva constitutes a hester over the Eva, which means that was a sign that the Yetzer Hara left the Achila and went into the sexual area. Adam Rishon before the Chet, his sexual Eva was neutral, it was like his hand. It had no significance at all, and he wasn't embarrassed about it at all. After the Chet, he suddenly had to put on clothes, he was embarrassed. He knew there was something about this organ that was different than before the Chet. You see, it grew an aura, which means that the sexual function, which is illustrated by the organ, you see, grew an aura of foreskin, which indicated a hester came over that sexual function. That means that the Yetzer Hara went into that particular slichus. Here we see a very, very critical principle. A very critical principle. That fundamentally, Adam Rishon before the Chet had one mitzvah. Why? Because what was that mitzvah? A mitzvah is nothing more than a gilui or revelation of where the Yetzer Hara resides, on which bodily function, or on which experience a person has, which has shaykh to the Satan, and therefore has shaykh to the Nisayan. Do you see the concept? That's what a mitzvah is. A mitzvah tells a person, do this, don't do that. You see. And by trying to listen to a mitzvah, by being kovish to Satan, right, a person earns certain schar. You see. But what's the fundamental base of a mitzvah? What's the fundamental basis of the mitzvah? The fundamental basis of the mitzvah is the fact that the reason why the mitzvah concerns this particular activity is because it is in this activity in which the Yetzer has a koyach and can make him feel like a gaiva. You see, and therefore the Nisayon lies in this area. So in other words, a mitzvah is nothing more than a revelation or a giloi of where the Yetzer exists, which particular experience or which activity the Yetzer is now involved in. You understand the concept? In other words, what is a mitzvah? A mitzvah is more than just the fact that the Rebbeinu Shem says, don't do this or do this. And therefore, you have to listen to what the Rebbeinu Shem says. If you listen to him, then you get schar. If you don't listen to him, then you get an einish. It's much more than that. The reason why the Rebbeinu Shem is able to give you a mitzvah in a certain area, each mitzvah involves a certain activity or human experience. You see, it involves a certain aspect of human behavior. Why do certain mitzvahs concern themselves with this area of human behavior and certain mitzvahs concerned with other areas? What it fundamentally means is that the reason why a mitzvah was given on this area of human behavior is because this area of human behavior is what is infused with the koyach of the Satan to promote a feeling of gaiva. That's the concept. There are areas of human experience which don't have anything to do with mitzvahs. Why? Because the Satan or the Yetzer is not involved with these areas. And since he's not involved, doing them or not doing them does not make a person a gaiva or an honor. It's neutral. For example, breathing. Breathing is a necessity of the body. But when you breathe, do you feel big, important? No, the idea is absurd. You see? And since you don't feel, it means there is no gaiva attached with breathing or not. It doesn't do anything for your own sense of self, for your own sense of self-importance at all. So since it has nothing to do with it, it means that there's no Satan in the area of breathing. So since there's no Satan in the area of breathing because there's no inyan of geirus, it was never given as a mitzvah to breathe 3 times a minute, but not 5, or something on that level. You see, but the truth of the matter is that had there been an aspect of geirus in some way, then there would have been a mitzvah that would have had to do with a person's breathing.
They come as a kufr.
You see, that's the point. Breathing has always remained a bodily function which remained neutral to the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer has nothing to do with breathing. So therefore, breathing does not lend to either gaiva or nava. So there is no mitzvah. So in other words, a mitzvah, which is the command of the Rebbeinu Shem, involves a certain area of human behavior or human function. And the mitzvah reveals to us that there is a Yetzer Hara connected with this area of human function. That's what the mitzvah reveals to us. That's why that area of human function was given in the form of a mitzvah. And it is that human function which now becomes the pivot of the Nisayon of whether we want to listen to the Rebbeinu Shalom or we don't want to listen to them because we want to listen to ourselves. This is the basic concept. That's what a mitzvah is. In other Rishon Kodim Achet, the Yetzer was concerned only with Achila and with nothing else. After the Chet, the Yetzer moved. He expanded. Now, he still remained in Achila also. He also remained in eating. However, his main abode of Ashpor left Achila and went into the sexual area. But not only that, it expanded also. After the Chet of Adam Rishon, the Yetzer expanded in 7 different areas of human experience and function. That's why there were 7 mitzvahs. That's what it means, that there were 7 mitzvahs. That because of the kilkul that Adam introduced in the Bria, because of the Zoyama that he introduced in the Bria, the Yetzer expanded. And when it expanded, it went into new areas of human function and experience where it wasn't before. And these were 7 areas. And because they're now in these 7 areas, these 7 areas are now connected with a mitzvah of do or don't in some way. They're connected with the Nisayon of whether or not you want to listen to the Rebbeinu Shalom. They're connected to the teaching of Na'am Tzufa, and therefore they're connected with your ability to get Olam Haba. In other words, Adam, in order to massacre Na'am Tzufa, only had to keep one mitzvah because the Yetzer was only involved with that one mitzvah. I have coined the term, and I say that experience of eating by Adam Rishon Kodim Achet was Satanized from the word Satan. In other words, the function of eating was Satanized. That's where the Yetzer Hara was embedded. after the Chet of Adam Rishon, there were 7 areas which became Satanized. And all of the areas remained unsatanized in that sense. Now, after Noach, the world continued in the Chatoim and the Averis. So after a while, the Yetzer began to expand even further. Till finally it expanded into 613 different areas of human experience. 613 different aspects of human behavior and function became Satanized. So since they became Satanized, it means that all these different areas now are subject to Gaiva, and subject to Merida, you see, and subject to Nesoyan. That's why the corresponding aspect, the fact that they are all Tayag Mitzvahs. You see, the Tayag Mitzvahs correspond to the 613 areas of human experience and functions which have become Satanized. So therefore, in order to Masakin Nam the Tzufa, you've got to get rid of the Yetzer Hara now from 613 areas. Adam only had to get rid of the Satan from one area. Noach, and from him on they had to get rid of the Satan from 7 areas. But after Matan Torah, the Jews had to get rid of the Satan from 613 areas, because he expanded into 613 different places, positions of strength. So therefore we see a very important principle, that as man does more chatoim, the Yetzer expands meaning that the tumah resides in more human bodily functions and experiences, and so on. Which means that man has to, in order to masaket dam l'ksufa, he has to be able to deal with more and more areas of his totality, of his experience, so the avodah becomes harder and harder. You see, Adam only had to deal with one area that was Satanized, the achila. And after Noach already dealt with 7, and then Moshe had to Megala 613. Now, could it go on more than 613? The answer is no. And that's the meaning of the mitzvah Baal Tosef Sigra. The Baruch says you cannot add 613, nor can you subtract. Why? Because the Baruch says no matter how much more kilkul you bring in the Bria, it will not go more than 613 areas. That is the maximum. You see. That's what the Indian and so on, or the Milner. It cannot go any further than that. Now we understand a very important thing. When it says in the Torah, Barasi Yetzer Hara, there's a pasuk that says, Barasi Yetzer Hara, Barasi Torah Tavlem. The pasuk says, I created the Yetzer Hara, and I created the Torah as a cure, as an antidote. We see that there are 2 different meanings, an inner and an outer meaning. The outer meaning, or the most surface level as well. The main way that you have to combat the Yetzer Hara is by Torah. The Torah is the way that we have to combat the Yetzer Hara. You see. But it's deeper than that. The Torah, the Tzura of the Torah, the way the Torah takes its shape, is a giloi on exactly the Tzura of the Satan. When the Satan is only Satanized in one mitzvah, then the Torah itself is only composed of one mitzvah. If the Satan is now in 7 mitzvahs, then the Torah is in the Tzura of 7 mitzvahs. And finally, when the Satan is in 613 areas, then the Torah is B'tzuras Tayag, which shows a very important thing, that Adam Rishon had the Torah too, but Adam Rishon's Torah was Torah B'tzuras 1 mitzvah. Noach had the Torah B'tzuras 7 mitzvahs, and Klal Yisrael had the Torah B'tzuras 613. That's what's going on. That it's Zelu Ma'azeh, one thing as counterbalancing in the other. That depending on the manifestation of the Satan in the Bria, in terms of where the tumor resides and the Satanized aspects, that will be the number of mitzvahs and the kinds of mitzvahs that will be given to men. Because those are the mitzvahs that therefore have to interact or remove the areas of Satanization. One is against the other. Barasi Yetzer Hara, Barasi Torah Tavlin. That the Torah is the cure for the Yetzer Hara because it changes its form as the Yetzer Hara changes its form. One against the other, you see. As the Satan transforms and expands, then the Torah transforms and it expands. But Adam also had the Torah. That answers the question of the following that we asked. We all know that if Adam had not done the mitzvah, if Adam had performed the mitzvah, what would have happened? He would have gone to Olam Haba right then and there. So the question is, what about the Torah? He wouldn't begin the Torah. You see. So how could that be? Moshe brought down the Torah. Before Moshe Rabbeinu there was no Torah. Was there? Right? Adam didn't have the Torah, he only had one mitzvah. So in that case, if Adam would have gone to Olam Haba, what would have happened to the entire Torah? The answer is, Adam already had the Torah. But his Torah was in the form of one mitzvah. All the Torah mitzvahs were all condensed into one mitzvah. It was a condensation. Adam Rishon had the Torah, but Suas mitzvah achas, where all the Torah mitzvahs were condensed into one. As the Torah expanded, the Torah expanded into 7 different areas, 7 shvilim, or paths. So the Torah took on the tzur of that, in order to combat that. And then finally, with Moshe Rabbeinu, it expanded finally to 613 areas, which constitutes its maximum. But, that is what happens with the Torah itself, you see. That the Torah really was given to Adam, but that the Torah changed its surah, depending on the particular manifestation of the Yetzer Hara in that form. This is a very, very important principle, and that's what we mean by Boras Yetzer Hara, Boras Yetzer Hara Tavlin. That the Torah is an antidote for the Yetzer Hara, because it constantly changes with the Yetzer Hara, and it constantly is antagonistic to the Yetzer Hara in its surah. And it's always there to be changed. That's why, by understanding what the Torah is and the pnimis of the Torah, we can have a glimpse of what it was like with Adam Rishon Kodim Achet. We can have a glimpse of the world at that time, you see. Because the Torah is megal to us how the world itself changes at each different stage. Now, what about the Rabbanans? What is that? Well, the truth of the matter is, the expansion of the Satan can only be up to 613. Therefore, the Torah can only be up to Tayag mitzvahs. But the truth of the matter is, the Satan could expand even further. He can. Where can he expand? It cannot be more than 613 major categories. But within each mitzvah, it is possible to expand many expansions. You see? And that's where the Chachamim come in. The Chachamim are there to deal with the sub-expansions. You see? Where the expansions take place in a certain mitzvah. That even though the Yetzer is in a certain mitzvah, in a certain area of human activity, it doesn't mean that he is expanded in all of the sub areas. You see, but what it is that as the world gets worse and worse, then the Chazal came up and they said, "Wait a minute, we see from where the world is going that in this particular mitzvah there's going to be a further expansion." In other words, we see in the mitzvah of Kriya Shema, for example, that even though the Torah gave Kriya Shema to be Masakin, a certain area of expansion, we see that within the mitzvah itself, the Yetzer is going to expand further to try and make the person delay it until Shachar, so he won't even say it. In other words, there's a new aspect of trying to get a person not to say it, through Atlas, or whatever have you. So the Chazal said, we therefore have to take care of that expansion and make what's called a mitzvah chachamim. You see. So therefore, the chachamim themselves are not just eaters, it's not just a piece of advice. You see, a Gezerah Rabbon is not a piece of advice. It is an attempt to be masakin, a sub-expansion. That's why the Torah said you must listen to them, just like you listen to a Deraisa. Because just like the Tayag Mitzvahs deals with expansions, satanic expansions, Chazal also deal with satanic sub-expansions. But Chazal cannot increase over Tayag, because it cannot go further. You see, but they are allowed to create new gezeres within the sub-expansions. You see the point? That's the importance of Chazal. That's why it says that whenever Chazal wanted to be Masakin, they always try to Masakin something Ke'en Deraisa, just like the Torah. Why? Because fundamentally it's serving the same kind of purpose. Now, with that information, it tells us basically how Avraham knew it. Avraham knew the Tayag Mitzvahs. You know how? Not that it was revealed to him, but he knew from the Chokhmah, by understanding the nature of the Satan and the nature of the Yetzer Hara, he was able to understand that if the Kilkel is brought into the Bria, where the expansion of the Yetzer Hara would take place. And by understanding how the expansion of the Yetzer Hara would take place, he was able to understand what mitzvahs would automatically become needed in order to deal with those expansions. You see, it was from Chokhmah. He understood, you see what I'm saying? He understood the nature of satanic expansion itself. And once you understand the principles and the rules of satanic expansion, you begin understanding the kind of tzur that the Torah would take as well in order to deal with it. And that's why he even knew the Chachamim, the Chazal. How did he know the Chachamim? The Because it's the same thing. Once he understood the concept of satanic expansions and the principles of that type of expansion, he would understand not only the Taryag expansions, but he could also figure out the sub-expansions. That's how he knew even the Chachomim and the Erev Tashirin, for example. He knew it from that logic itself. I'm not going to go into now how the satanic expansion existed in each one of the areas and therefore came out to be a mitzvah. I don't want to go into each mitzvah. But what I'm giving you here is the basic concept. What is the pnimis of a mitzvah? That a mitzvah is a gilu or a revelation on the satanic expansion, you see. And that's the way each mitzvah has to be looked at. That when we say you have to learn the Taryag mitzvahs in terms of the halachas, that's one thing in terms of doing it. But if you want to understand the inner soul of a mitzvah, you must understand its tikkun. And its tikkun fundamentally is what? Is a counterpart. It's counter-representative, right? Of what the nature of the satanic expansion or the tumah that went into the area of human activity that generated the mitzvah in the first place. That's the way we have to understand all the Taryag mitzvahs and all the Rabbanim as well. They all have to be understood in that light. And that's how Avram understood it. And that's how he was able to know this even without the Matan Torah. So you may say, in that case, so what did Moshe tell us then? You see, the truth of the matter is Moshe was Megala more than Avram knew. But fundamentally, the Taryag expansion did not take place until Moshe Rabbeinu, until Klal Yisrael came on the scene. That even though Avram was able to understand already, you see, that the satanic expansions could occur in the six Taryag ways, you see, but it didn't occur to it yet. It started on it. That's why Avram knew that if he keeps the 650 mitzvahs, he helps push back the Satan from those areas. But the Satan did not expand into those areas yet, in total. So Avram was only an Eina Mitzvah as regard those areas. Avram had to keep the 7 mitzvahs. Why? Because the satanic expansion definitely occurred, was present in the 7 areas. So therefore he was a Mitzvah on the 7. In other words, that the world could not achieve its tikkun unless you performed those 7 mitzvahs. Now, the 630 mitzvahs did not occur yet. It did, only a little bit, you see. So therefore Avram knew that as an Eina Mitzvah, he can help in that sense. But it wasn't absolutely necessary yet. When did it become necessary? It became necessary by the Matan Torah. By the time of Matan Torah, it became an absolute necessity that in order for the Bria to establish its tikkun, you had to do Taryag mitzvahs. And therefore, every Jew after the Matan Torah became a mitzvah. An example can be given about this. For example, in terms of disease, once you understand how a certain bacteria operates, you're able to produce the antidote. You see, once you know exactly how a certain bacteria produces its harmful effects, for example, because it releases certain toxins and so on, you're able to produce antitoxins or whatever have you and so on. When we know the mechanism of a disease, we begin to understand how to combat that disease. That's what Avram knew. He knew the mechanism of the disease called the Yetzer Hara, or the satanization of Tumah and the Bria. He understood the expansion of Kilkul as it occurs in the Bria. Once he understood that, he therefore was able to understand the ways to remove that Kilkul. And even up to the level of sub-expansions as well, down to the area of the Chazal as well. Avram Avinu, even though he wasn't a mitzvah in terms of the Taryag mitzvahs, but Avram Avinu already knew that there was an expansion of the Tumah, of the Sitra Achra, into the 613 different areas of human experience already. So there was a Spashtus, but the Spashtus was only somewhat tentative. It wasn't a powerful Spashtus. So therefore, he knew that it is advisable to keep the Taryag mitzvahs, but it was not necessary. In other words, the tikkun of the Bria did not require Taryag mitzvahs. It didn't. But there already was a spashtus of the Satan into the 613 areas. That's why Avram, when he kept it, he only kept it as an Eina Mitzvah. But by the time of Klal Yisrael, by the time with Moshe Rabbeinu, the spashtus was already very great in the sense that the spashtus was already formalized in the 613 areas. Therefore, Klal Yisrael had to be Mitzvah on the Taryag mitzvahs. It wasn't enough for them simply to do it in an advisory capacity, as an Eina Mitzvah, like Avram. Now that we basically see the fundamental concept of what the Bechira person is, and how that Bechira is related to the Yetzer Hara, we can begin to see history in a much larger scope. Again, very simply put, the Yetzer Hara occupies or inhabits only certain specific kinds of human drives or bodily needs. He doesn't occupy all of them. As man does a sin, he occupies more and more facets of human behavior. What is the difference between a human experience in which he occupies and one in which he does not? The difference is that if he does not occupy a certain specific drive, then what happens is the fulfillment or the satisfaction of that drive simply means that there's a satisfaction of that drive and the body can survive. But there's nothing else which accrues to the body or to the person as a result. But if the Yetzer Hara infiltrates or resides in a certain specific drive, it means that as a person satisfies that drive, not only is there a physical fulfillment, but there's also a ego fulfillment. There's a certain sense of self which also accompanies that particular physical satisfaction. And because of that, the person now must choose whether he wants that ego satisfaction from that particular need, and therefore he wants to do it even though the Rebbeinu Shalom, let's say for example, says not to do it, or else he'll listen to the Rebbeinu Shalom and not do it. Because fundamentally, the Messianic of a person is whether or not he should listen to the Rebbeinu Shalom or not, which has to do with whether he holds himself to be independent of God, or if he holds himself to be dependent on the Rebbeinu Shalom. This is an ego matter. This is an affair of the ego. Thus, only those drives or those needs which in some way relate to the ego can be used or can be involved in the entire activity of Bechira. Drives which do not relate to the ego as such cannot relate to the aspect of Bechira or the Messianic of a person in that way. The more man sins, the more activities and the more experiences, human experiences that he has relate to ego fulfillment, or which incur gaiva. And this is what we find, that as man sinned more and more of his needs and drives became subject to the residence of the hashpah of the Yetzer Hara, so that the Yetzer Hara was able to use these various needs as a Nisoyan in gaiva, and the soin in Yeshua Mavadoi, and the soin in certain aspects of ego fulfillment. And this is fundamentally the progress of the Yetzer Hara in the human organism as he submits more and more to Chet and to the kilkul of the Zoyama. This is where you see in the word itself. The word need in Hebrew is tzorech. The human needs as such don't necessarily relate to the Yetzer Hara. However, when the need becomes related to the Yetzer Hara, so that it's invested with some kind of ego fulfillment, then it's called a taiva. The word taiva is different than just tzorech. Taiva is much stronger. Taiva means that the person desires it in a much more powerful way. That's because the satisfaction of the tzorech, if it's a taiva, has with it